action figure industry is changing for better and for worse, and one of the stepping stones in that progress would have to be these companies deciding to take a much more high caliber approach of introducing new waves and series that go above and beyond as far as price allocation and quality assurance. And whether we like it or not, Marvel Legends technically initiated this with the Maximum series, allowing popular characters like Spidey and the Incredible Hulk to come with more accessories, allocation of articulation, and even some paint decals, extra little tidbits that could be packaged into the box at that price point. Well, it looks like McFarlane Toys is going to be following suit with the Elite Edition, effectively doing the same strategy as far as heightening up the price a little bit, but this will then allow some more applications of paint deco, detail, sculpt work, and then of course some extra, much more premium feeling accessories to be bundled in the box, along with a tie-in reward system called Elite Points that will hopefully create some sort of incentive to then be able to kind of build a form of brand loyalty for the Elite Edition series. Whether or not that's actually going to make an impact and create that desired effect has yet to be seen. But for now, we're definitely going to be ripping and tearing until this review for Elite Edition number 1 gets completed. And that's for the Doom the Dark Ages Doomslayer. I know I typically have a bit of a habit of creating these sort of comparisons between previous iterations that McFarlane Toys has tackled versus their newer, much more improved and refined 2.0 iterations, reissues, whatever you want to call them, but that's not necessarily going to be the case here, considering that I unfortunately missed out on their original Doomslayer when Doom Eternal got released at the beginnings of 2020. At the time, I wasn't really kind of on the McFarlane Toys train. I was kind of barely knowing exactly what they were all about, so I'm not necessarily going to have that original version to compare here. I have seen, however, some preliminary images to kind of build this idea that there was definitely an existing blueprint or a DNA pattern to stem from and build their first Elite Edition release in the form of the Doom the Dark Ages specific portrayal of the Slayer, which is going to be taking a much more medieval approach as far as the armor, as far as the fur cape, of course, an awful lot of little details and aesthetical choices that they made for some of the little attributes to his outfit, specifically anything that has to do with like leather, straps, chainmail, anything that just kind of spews medieval ages, you're practically going to find it on his design. So you could argue that the recipe was primed for McFarlane to take on, considering that not only do they have a little bit of a history with this IP, but it's just right up Todd's wheelhouse because, hell, they have a Spawn, which is Todd's original IP, and he legitimately made him into a medieval character, not just in the comics, but even in toy form. There's a whole goddamn Kickstarter around it. So them having their Elite Edition be on the most medieval version of the Doomslayer per the game, yeah, this is ultimately something that is going to be very difficult for McFarlane to mess up as far as the paint applications, texture, and sculpt work are concerned. Something that, I gotta be honest, it's going to be very, very difficult to argue. From when I saw the preliminary promo shots, the reveals, and even seeing it in hand prior to this review back at the McFarlane Toys VIP San Diego event, I noticed that it legitimately made an impression on me. It definitely had some shelf presence to him as far as the paint applications are concerned. And that definitely did not wave in any format here, putting him in a proper light box with the right amount of lighting from all directions, because there's an awful lot of really great design work as far as the sculpting for the armor, the chunkiness of the physique that the Doomslayer is known for, and the weightiness of the figure is incredibly solid. When you think of a figure that is being price pointed at $60, or in my case, considering how lucky I got, $50 when you walk into Walmart, which at the time of this video still doesn't necessarily have the most clearest of explanations. That's still something that I truly do wish McFarlane was a little bit more transparent on, and I still have to call them out a little bit on it because there's still legitimately no explanation as to why it is that some of these figures, whether it be Elite Editions or even some of the Mega figures, etc., that are get priced at $60 elsewhere, end up getting a slight little bit of a $10 discount. Whether or not that's connected also with the fact that some of these figures end up at Walmart a little earlier than other retailers could be correlated or not, I don't know. It's just pure speculation. But for the time being, whether you look at it from a $50 or $60 perspective, you see some of that money definitely come through in the paint applications. To me, my favorites would arguably be, again, where you can definitely see McFarlane excels within their strengths, which would have to be any part that's made out of this airbrushed, really rustic looking metal, particularly the gauntlets, the spikes that are protruding out of them. The gloves are immaculate as far as, like I said, getting that weathered look. And frankly, when it boils down to the legs, it's pretty much all of these parts right here with the different plates and segmentations of the armoring happening alongside the thighs, the paint applications that was utilized to give it, like I said, that worn out airbrush look. And then navigating all the way across right here, you'll notice some accents of green, that kind of guacamole green, as I like to call it, that is applied to some of those plates right there, navigating upwards to arguably one of my favorite variations of the texture and material that's utilized for this chainmail. You can kind of make out a little bit of it that is not only dangling off of this cod piece, but then furthermore, you have even more chainmail effect happening alongside of the texture inside of the legs. When you kind of navigate just a little on the underside of the crotch, you have more of that chainmail, and then an awful lot of it happening alongside the abdomen. You have these plates that cover up the front of the abdomen, but then on the side of the obliques, you'll make out more of that chainmail effect that ultimately feels really great in hand, and like I said, it's painted beautifully. But the parts that are made out of the green and brown paint applications are no slouches either. You can definitely tell that they took pretty much every part of the experiences that they've gained from developing Spawn figures, horror themed figures, whether they're movie tie-ins or not, and then most definitely anything that has to do with the occult, or for lack of a better term, demonic imagery, and applied it to Doomslayer. Again, one of the most appropriate properties to tackle that head on. And they definitely nailed it as far as the visual fidelity of the figure is concerned. Specifically, these shins, pretty much everything that makes up the bottom parts, the bottom halves of the legs. You'll notice an awful lot of the individual sculpt work happening alongside the boot, the plates with the spikes here at the front of the armor. Everything right here just looks more like 90% immaculate. I left out that little bit of a 10% because you will notice that, yes, you have a couple of little paint linings, specifically the one on the left that's just a tiny little bit off, which does get categorized as a slight little QC problem. And thankfully, I was lucky to note very minimal QC issues happening alongside my figure as far as those paint applications are concerned. I did note one of them right there, and then upon closer inspection, I did notice that a little bit of that chrome paint, the silver paint, did manage to rub off a little bit on the right knee. But apart from that, I haven't necessarily found anything else humongously detrimental on my unit. I have to be very specific to say that it was on my unit, because when I found him in Walmart, there were technically 3 whole units found on the shelf. So I was kind of spoiled for choice. But it's a good thing that I was very analytical in scanning the figure up and down from within the window, because I still have to point this out in the review, despite not taking either of them home. But I was about to walk away from the aisle with a particular unit that did in fact have a bit of a black splotch on one of the exposed biceps here, with a little bit of skin texture happening right there, which thankfully on my unit is airbrushed really nicely to kind of emulate that hairy effect that he's got going on his massive testosterone fueled biceps, along, not just because of how massive and girthy the muscles are, but he's even got legitimate hair protruding out of his biceps. That's how manly this guy is. And they did a pretty serviceable job of kind of delivering that with the paint applications, but they went a little crazy on one other unit that I found in the aisle that did have a splotch on one of them. So I put that guy back, picked up another, and then that one had a splotch on one of the plates here on the thigh. So I lucked out on the third and final unit that, like I said, has the most minimal amount of QC problems that I was still able to detect. But it's definitely something to consider when you receive yours, either from being ordered in, or if you happen to stumble upon them at Walmart's or Target's, whatever the case may be, because it does seem like the QC aspect of the figure could still be put a little bit into question, especially when you're dealing with a price point of $50 to $60. But if you were to play some devil's advocate, you could argue that maybe those extra little bits of splotches are mainly there because of how much they didn't cut back on the legitimate paint applications for the figure, because generally one of the things that McFarlane is often criticized for is having certain figures, certain sculpts, or even vehicles that feel great in terms of the actual molding and the plastic and how they manage to sculpt it all out, but then missing certain paint applications to bring it to life. That is most still definitely not the case when it comes to this Doomslayer. You feel an awful lot of what was represented in the game brought to life here from a perspective of the paint applications and in the 7-inch form. In terms of basically the analogy that I always like to create, or the metaphor that I always use, is that when a figure feels like the maquette that the visual effects department, or in this case the game developers, use to then model into the game, kind of like scan up and down and then have it be put virtually into the game so they can manipulate it, that's when I feel like you more or less nailed it from an action figure perspective. And that's not necessarily unlike the figure that you see before you here. Specifically, like I said, when it comes to the spikes, the little circle that's here, obviously there's a lore explanation as to why that's there. But when you kind of look beyond those two plates, you'll then even notice a little bit of the Under Armour that he's got going on right there for the cut off sleeves, a little bit more of like these little extra parts, the straps here on the shoulders, and then of course the helmet. Now, I admit that I kind of wish that there was a way to sort of faintly paint in, I don't want to say the eyes, but just kind of like that faded effect that you can kind of make out a little bit of the bridge of his nose and his brow from this side of the helmet like it is in game. Kind of wish that there was a way to apply that via some sort of paint application there on the visor, but as far as what they managed to attribute here with, again, that metallic feel to the top and bottom parts of the visor, as well as the overall sculpt work around the helmet, specifically these nice little spikes here at the top, are quintessential Doomslayer from the Dark Ages, and I like that. Of course, no way to talk about the actual premium feel of the figure from a design standpoint and not talk about, of course, the big thing that's probably going to be garnering an awful lot of collectors' attention, which is going to be this faux fur cape. Because naturally, when kind of calling out the head sculpt right here, you'll notice that you do have a few of these little pieces of faux fur and little hairs kind of sticking out a little abrasively, especially when pulling him out of the package. You're going to have to futz and sort of comb them kind of out of the side to make them flush and feel natural to the overall area of the collar. But when you then kind of pull the cape a little bit more down, you'll notice that yes, you do have a bit of a wool faux fur, fake fur sort of effect happening with the cape. Unfortunately, no, it is not wired. There's no kind of wiring found whatsoever. It's simply just what appears to be nylon. I could be wrong about this. I could be completely wrong, but I do appreciate the fact that they took this sort of fabric and simply just applied the fur. And this is effectively what I was kind of expecting it to be when they revealed that they were going to be incorporating a faux fur sort of texture to the cape. I was sort of expecting this, and it does the job. And so far from the 72 hours that I've had this figure, the fur hasn't necessarily shed or released any of the hair fibers to kind of be laid out all over the place. That hasn't necessarily been a major discrepancy, so it's good to see that so far it's held its own. There is still a part of me that wishes that it was wired, and technically speaking, I feel like someone who's into customizing or modding their figures could probably do so by applying some kind of wire on the underside. I just don't necessarily know how they would have been able to stitch it by fabric mass production design. I'm pretty certain there's a solution. I just can't really think of it at the time being. I do know that when you lift the cape up, you're kind of given better access to more of those glorious little patterns, specifically everything that's pretty much happening here towards the back, specifically with more additional pieces of chainmail. You have the straps, of course, applications for what seems to be demonic skin kind of stitched together to form a little bit of this ass piece here towards the back, more of those pouches. And then, if you couldn't already tell, of course, you have a legitimate die-cast chain. It's not necessarily heavy, it's similar to the stuff that you expect keychains to dangle off of your rings, but they did incorporate that to kind of give it a little bit of added flair and presence to, again, add the premium quality of the figure and up it up a little bit of a notch. The only thing that I think the faux fur cape does kind of hamper down a little bit would have to be the gun that's on the side of his shoulder here, the little turret gun that pops up when you upgrade him accordingly. I kind of wish that it was articulated. It's very reminiscent of what I was able to deduce the original Doom Eternal Slayer had in that original release. it doesn't necessarily look like they articulated it. It looks like they sculpted it the exact same way it did prior, where it's simply just a bendy rubberized piece that just kind of lays there. And you can technically nudge it from side to side, and it's painted, like I said, pretty decently, just as well as the rest of the chromed armor pieces. But there's a part of me that just feels that I wish that I could give it a little bit of additional function besides just laying there. And whenever it comes to me kind of futzing and messing around with the cape, it does sometimes hinder itself or gets caught a little bit upon this gun. So I kind of wish that there was a way for these two to sort of complement to each other a little bit more favorably. But in hindsight, this turret gun is not necessarily made to be articulated. But what about the points that are supposed to be part of the articulation? That's where we do get into ultimately the figure's biggest Achilles heel and probably the biggest contesting factor towards the Elite Edition series and the price point that it sets itself at. Because ironic enough, the head is probably one of the better complemented points of articulation, considering that you have the cape on the sides and towards the back right here. So you would think that it was probably going to be able to limit it, but in honesty, it's able to rotate the full 360 degrees. Just do be careful of pulling in on any of those fur fibers. But in terms of tilting and nudging up and down and even side to side, it's pretty complementary. It's pretty fluid. So you're able to get an awful lot of emotion or expression out of a character that doesn't necessarily have any expressions to be able to evoke. So that's pretty interesting. But when it comes to the top arms, that's where we get into our first major hindrance, because you are able to rotate the arms fully 360 no problem, but when it comes to extension, it can only nudge just shy of the 90-degree angle. It's pretty much stuck at the 45, maybe 50-ish degree, and the shoulder guards are technically applied to the bottom part of the shoulder here, not the top, but even so, they're sculpted just so massively and so rigid that you end up with the joints kind of just stomping shy of about right there. So he's not really able to do a full-blown T-pose like you would probably have the in-game model be able to do. And you could practically forget about any kind of butterfly or shrugging motion. I've tried it numerous times on both arms, and it's practically non-existent. It can only like slightly nudge, but I can't tell if that's because of a legitimate function within the joint or simply just because the pieces are separated by default. So you could practically forget about that. And then we get into some more contesting factors that could or could not make or break the articulation for certain collectors, because here I'm going to be conjoining two groups, the elbows and the knees, because they both decided to take the approach of mega figure articulation versus that of your standard 7-inch McFarlane Toys action figure. Because typically with 7-inch figures, you have double bended knees and double bended elbows. But instead, because of how chunky and massive this guy is, he's only really got one elbow bent. So you'll notice that you have the hinge baked in, allowing the elbow to bend almost at the 90 degree. I'd say it's more about a 80 to 85 degree angle, right about right there. But just right above the knee, right above the elbow, just below the bicep, you do in fact have a swivel. So you technically still have your two joints, but they're not going to be the same. You're not going to have double bends. You instead just have one simple bend and the swivel to allow articulation and horizontal rotation off to the sides like so. Skipping a little bit ahead to the similar technologies being applied to another area that typically has double bends, you have the knees. You're able to only really bend the knee at a 90-ish degree angle. Again, it just stops a little shy of the 90 degrees, almost about the 80 to 85 because of how massive this piece of armor around the leg really is. And then just below the knee, you'll have your swivel rotation that allows the bottom half of the leg to rotate all the way around 360. And once again, the rigidness of that articulation is just a little scary to the point where mine is legitimately cracking. And that's already after giving it a slight pass with the hair dryer. So I'm getting a little nervous that this guy is probably not meant to move as much as you would expect an action figure to do, which means that maybe McFarlane took the whole stand and fight tagline that Bethesda and id were applying to Doom the Dark Ages versus its predecessors just a little too literally. A similar impression is made by the torso joints, because you do have a mid-torso cut right here halfway across the abdomen that definitely allows the top part of the body to slightly rotate towards the left and towards the right. It almost feels like it turned a full 360, but because of how massive the top part of the abdomen and the chest area, the chest plate is sculpted, I kind of don't want to press my luck considering that it just stops right about right there and I start to get a little bit of resistance. Same thing towards the other side, except it looks like it almost feels like it can kind of give way if I give it a slight little crunch, but I'd rather just focus the crunching on the vertical when you kind of have all this lined up, front and back. You can see right there that I can definitely crunch pretty favorably up and down right there, no problem. I legitimately don't know what to tell you guys as far as the waist, because every time I try to grab the waist, I accidentally end up rotating the top joint that I just showed you. Whenever I try to move the waist in terms of horizontal rotation, I practically don't feel any. I don't know if mine is stuck. I don't know if there's practically non-existent. I don't know if it was maybe edited out, quote unquote, at the very last second, but I just don't find any legitimate rotation happening there. In terms of any kind of crunching or extension, I can kind of feel it nudging up and down so slightly and side to side, but it's not as fluid as that as the mid-torso joints. So the waist is definitely a bit lackluster, and I don't know if it's attributed to the way that this overall cod and belt piece is designed, or it's simply because of how everything else feels rather rigid and tight, overly tight, that's simply just a symptom of building such a very robust and girthy character like the Doomslayer. Now, thankfully, the top leg joints are not necessarily as problematic. You can definitely lift the legs higher than I was anticipating. Of course, it's not as high as your typical Batman, Superman, DC Multiverse characters, but you're at least able to get about that far, right about right there. An extension towards the backs is actually even better because I legitimately was not expecting it to be able to extend that much. It does create a little bit of a gap right about right there, but you'll notice that the top leg joints are definitely much more of the freer ones across the overall blueprint of the articulation, to the point where it can even extend off towards the sides and create this amount of splittage, if you will, considering all the little, like I said, additions of sculpt work and armor plating. That the way that the legs are able to move that far is pretty astounding. I've already covered the knees, but to end on a slightly sour note would have to be these boots, because if you couldn't already tell, these boots, these overall pieces of armor around the shin, are so bombastically large that I was already kind of expecting the worst in terms of articulation, and I was practically not even that wrong. They're sculpted very similarly to some other mega figures that I've taken into account. You'll notice that the foot here is on a hinge of sorts in terms of the joint for the boot, for the ankle at least, and it's sculpted into the rest of the leg. So what this means is that basically the foot is able to pivot downwards like so and upwards like that, and the upwards movement is allowed ever so slightly by the rubberized piece here at the front of the foot here, at the front towards the bottom of the shin, that is technically made of this rubberized plastic, or this piece of rubber that is a little bit bendy to allow an extra bit of slack. But apart from that, you can practically forget about anything else. Definitely no kind of ankle rotation whatsoever. I tried nudging it as much as I possibly could, and if you couldn't already tell from the squeaking, it can ever so slightly pivot and incline inwards and outwards to allow a little bit of flat footing, but it's definitely leaving a lot to be desired as far as posability and balancing. So when you kind of get these feet to be flush as best as possible down on a flat surface like so, you result in this. But if you're thinking of any kind of like dynamic posing, yeah, I got some potential bad news. It's gonna be incredibly limiting, to the point where I'm not necessarily gonna be able to fight anyone who argues that this guy is more or less a very posable statue. And your biggest amounts of reprieve are more or less going to be found in the hand joints, which I admittedly almost forgot. But maybe it's a blessing in disguise that I saved these for last, because even though you do have full horizontal 360 rotation there at the wrist, being allowed by the peg that goes into the cuff inside of the wrist, you also have these hinges baked into the palms that allow the hands to be able to bend inwards and outwards. And the reason for why I consider that to be possibly a overall blessing to consider is the fact that by default here, you'll notice that the gesture that he's got not only on the right but also on the left is that of what could be considered trigger fingers. They're slightly triggerized in terms of gesture, but at the same time, I feel like the index finger on the right is a bit more extended than that of the left. But there's definitely a reason for why that is the case, and that's because we're going to be covering the Elite Edition treatment that was given to the accessories for the Doomslayer, which, if there's a character that requires definitive attention to detail and sculpt and badassery for his armaments, it would be the Doomslayer, right? First, the essential super shotgun, which is of course one of the more iconic forms of weaponry, trailing back all the way to the original Doom, not just for the brand new id Software franchise, but also the iconic classic that could be played on pregnancy tests these days. And obviously, we have it being incorporated here with Doomslayer, not just because of the property that he's pulled from the Dark Ages, but also because with McFarlane specifically, they've tackled the super shotgun before with their iteration of the Doomslayer from Doom Eternal, which also came included with the super shotgun. And this time, they also have lesser excuses to not include it, considering that, for those of you who don't know, Doom the Dark Ages is technically a prequel, and therefore you're going to have a much more pared down super shotgun that's going to be including a little bit less decoration, a little bit less augmentation as far as upgrades and little doodads, specifically the meat hook, which is one of the best things about the super shotgun in Doom Eternal. And as such, you're going to have a much slimmer, less, like I said, paint application driven super shotgun, which you could argue kind of gives a little bit of leeway towards McFarlane, who's been often criticized for incorporating accessories or certain paint sculpts or sculptures of any kind of action figures that have a little bit of lacking paint applications. And here, they didn't necessarily have to worry about that all too much. You nevertheless do get a nice brush of this kind of wooden brown, dark brown mahogany style paint applications to the underside of the rifle in and of itself. And then, of course, that nice little airbrush gunmetal that you have coating the entirety of the barrels. You even have the iconic double hammers here on each side of the gun itself, and of course you have the stock with a little bit of added little details sculpted on either side. The only thing that I will slightly criticize would have to be this little guard that is able to cover up the fingers that manage to loop around the stock. It's a little flimsy, it does feel a little bit wobbly and not too self-asserting as far as being able to kind of stay there. I feel like over time this might develop a little bit of a tear and start to kind of peel apart, but at least the rest of the gun is sculpted pretty nicely as far as its build quality. But now let's jump from the classic to the much more modern. This is a very specific weapon for the Dark Ages video game, and that's going to be this flail, this Mason flail, which is basically the much more emphatic melee weapon that's utilized in Doom the Dark Ages to kind of tie it much more to the strategic development of the game, the whole stand and fight mantra of being able to parry and get a little bit much more close and personal between the Doomslayer and the enemies. And one of the things to help him out is going to be this mace, along with, like I said, the flail connected to it. And as far as sculpting and detail, it's pretty much similar to that of the super shotgun, where you have that same kind of gunmetal paintbrush covering up the top side of the handle. You have a little bit of brown stripe kind of covering up here towards the end, and then the mace in and of itself is lacking a little bit of paint detail, you could argue, but at the same time, that's arguably how it looked like in the game, so you can't really criticize it too much for being more or less accurate, sans some little bits of maybe detail as far as the sculpt is concerned. But again, it's pretty solid, very pointy, and of course the biggest little detail that gives it a little breath of life would have to be the die-cast chain that's connecting the two pieces, very similar to the chain that is incorporated into his belt for the set dressing. But before I move on to other weapons included in the set, I kind of wanted to bring a little bit of attention of applying the flail along with the super shotgun onto the body of the figure itself, because like I noted before, the default hands that he comes with right out of the box are kind of designed or gestated in a way to form sort of trigger fingers, and I think that's probably most evident on the right. You'll notice that you have a little bit of the index finger sort of extended, because naturally that's where he's holding the super shotgun across the different games. Of course, if you have the natural orientation. Naturally in the settings you could always kind of toggle it to make it look like classic Doom, where you have the rifle in the center of the screen. screen. But if you want it to be on by default like the devs intended, you're going to have it off to the right. Whereas on the left, I would say that this is the hand that's probably the one designed a bit more to be sort of tailoring over to the flail, and it naturally pops in there pretty nicely. You can see right there that's decorated pretty nice, and I have no real qualms with that. It's really when we get to the super shotgun that things get just a little bit testy, because putting in the shotgun into said trigger hand is not only a little bit on the difficult side, considering how rigid the fingers are then designed and sculpted to the point where you're gonna probably have to give it an extra pass with that hairdryer to loosen them up. But after you do so, you'll notice that we have just a tiny little bit of an orientation problem, because he'll be holding the super shotgun like so, which in a relaxed position like that, to kind of make him look like he's forming aura, as the kids like to say these days, doesn't necessarily look all that bad. But what about if you want to put him in a pose that makes him look like he's aiming the gun? Well, that's where we do run into a bit of a kerfuffle, because you'll notice that he can't really aim it all that well. The shotgun is more or less aiming upwards like so, because I feel like they sculpted the trigger hand in an, like I said, in a gesture or in an orientation that I feel favors more so traditional firearms like a pistol or even an SMG. Guns that are probably a bit more akin to the Doomslayer in his much more contemporary state in Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, rather than it was in Doom the Dark Ages. And as such, you're going to have the shotgun pointing up like so. So it could probably favor a pose to make him look like he's probably taking on one of the more massive enemies in the game. But if you want him to point the shotgun straight forward and have it at a bit of an incline, they unfortunately kind of screw themselves in the way that they embedded the joint into the wrist, because it's perpendicular to the palm. Because at this point, it would have been nice if maybe there was a dedicated trigger hand, the likes of which I know for a fact, unless I'm having a bit of a Mandela effect, I know for a fact a previous DC Multiverse character, I want to say it was like a Joker character, I can't remember which specific Joker, but there was a character in the DC Multiverse line that had a bonus hand that was practically a trigger gun-holding hand. He was, oriented like so, with the trigger finger extended, but the wrist joint was parallel to the palm as opposed to perpendicular, so technically you can bend it like so instead of like this. And because of that joint being developed in that way, you were able to then point the gun naturally like, you would in real life, like so, up and down. And therefore, you'd be able to kind of have the gun pointed straight. And sadly, that's not exactly what happened with either the default trigger hand that he comes right out of the box like so, or with the extra pair of hands. Yeah, you heard right. Pair, not pairs, just one extra pair. Yeah, 4 hands total for an Elite Edition. I said this from day one when it was first revealed, and sadly I'm going to say it again here in the final review. These are way too much of a short assortment of hands. We needed extra hands. And it's funny because technically speaking, we are going to be getting more Elite Edition entries with much more hands. If I'm not mistaken, Lilith and the Persona 3 protagonist will come with, I think, a total, for sure, 6 hands. But I think somewhere in there I saw an even 4th pair, 8 total hands. And I get it, those figures are a little bit more on the slimmer physique approach, and therefore they're going to require less plastic allocation, and they can afford to include those extra hands. I'm sorry, but at this point in the game, I feel like the same could have been done with the Doomslayer here, especially the Doomslayer, considering that I feel like between these 3 characters that I just mentioned, the Persona 3 protagonist, Lilith from Diablo 4, and then the Doom guy / Doomslayer. If I was in charge, I would say that the Doomslayer probably takes priority. More people are going to know exactly who he is. And at worst case scenario, someone on the street will just confuse him with the guy from Halo. I mean, I won't. I know it's blasphemous, but just take yourself out of the equation as a hardcore fan and just think of your average Walmart customer. You show him this, they're going to say either Doom or they're going to say Halo. And so I feel like with that brand recognition, you should at least invest a little bit more in the Elite Edition with an extra pair of hands. And I'm not asking for anything crazy, simply just either, like I mentioned before, a dedicated trigger hand that has that parallel joint that's able to allow the hand to be able to bend this way as opposed to this way, Or when it comes to this bonus hands, which you're practically dealing with yet another asymmetric assortment in the form of the right hand being a fist, which I get is supposed to favor the other method to be able to deliver melee blows, because if you look a little carefully, you'll notice that this right fist does in fact have much more spikes embedded into the knuckles to deliver those final blows. Those, what would have been actual death animations, those actual glory kills that we had in Doom Eternal that subsequently ended up getting cut out of Doom the Dark Ages. I'm sorry, a little bit of a mini rant on the game's design there, but I digress. Nevertheless, though, you do get that added fist for the right, and then for the left, you technically have a much more open, closed-fingered hand for the left orientation without any of those spikes, but still decently painted and sculpted. But the reason for why it's garnering this specific gesture is to hold one of the more iconic pieces of armament inside of Doom the Dark Ages, which is going to be his shield, the one that delivers all of those parry blows that again feed into the whole mentality and strategy of the third game, to stand and fight and be a bit more head-on about your combat choices. And the shield is a little bit divisive, considering that the paint applications utilized are very similar to that were incorporated into the Doom figure, where I feel like the paint is done really beautifully as far as this specific green with the weathered look. Of course, you have that gunmetal design to not only the bust saws here on the side of the shield that are able to function in the game. Part of me kind of wishes that maybe they could have functioned here on the figure itself, but that would have definitely allocated the price to being somewhere around the $100 area. But apart from that, you also have this little yellow accent embedded right there. The sculpting is very nice off over to the side, and you even have the little ritualistic symbol there on the front that brings the Doomslayer back to life. Of course, everything that has to do with the Doomslayer incorporated into the new modern lore of where he comes from this symbol right here. When you flip it onto the underside is where we get to, like I said, some of the more conflicting areas about the shield, because as much as I love the build quality and it feels so solid that I'm able to believe that this thing is going to be able to withstand and parry a punch, you are then dealt with this handle that at first I thought was articulated, only to then realize that it's simply just a bendy rubberized piece of plastic that kind of flexes in that way to make sure that it's not brittle enough to break at a simple little press. But at the same time, there's a little part of me that's similar to the turret gun on his shoulder. Part of me kind of wishes that it was a little bit articulated to be able to either flush all the way down or flex on over to the other side or rotate in a way to at least allow me to not only incorporate this shield on over to the left hand that you're able to then swap out for the gripping hand on the left to then use on the shield on the left, but also maybe have some kind of functionality on the right, even though I know that that's not game accurate, because in the game, you only had the shield on the left, but at the same time, it's an action figure. Kind of wish I could have played around with those expectations just a tad bit. Plus, it doesn't really help that from time to time, the weightiness, the heftiness of the shield does sort of kind of come back to haunt the shield in and of itself when placing it on the hand. It is a little heavy to where he doesn't, unless you have it at a perfect angle, it kind of rests up against the side of his forearm. But when it's not, it has a tendency to fall off very, very frequently. Plus, it would make up for a little bit of the QC problems that could be found a little on the surface of the shield. You'll notice that there's a couple of little lines sculpted and washed away a little bit there. It's almost like a little bit of a plastic seam when they gelled this whole and sculpted and molded this whole thing together. So something that I unfortunately was not able to see right from the outside of the box, considering that this was covered up by the little Elite Edition symbol on the corner of the box. So that was masqueraded just a tad bit. But to me, the biggest problem is, again, not having extra hands, because even if we didn't get an oriented trigger hand that feels a bit more natural with its articulation and pointing the gun in the right direction, I at least would have liked some opposite oriented hands like these. So say, for example, a shield hand for the right or a fist for the left. And that would have been just fine. I'm not asking for a terrible amount. Just simply take these sculpts and flip them. I honestly, priced at $60, I don't necessarily understand why that couldn't be achieved. But maybe there's a form of an argument found in the last weapon that's included in this set, which is arguably my favorite. And that's going to be the Pulverizer, or as some have taken a liking to calling it, the Skull Crusher. Understandably so, because as you can see, this weapon legitimately takes human skulls trapped in the underworld and uses them as ammo, fitting it into this nice little hole, this little compartment here at the top, and then literally crushing them into little splinters that then can be launched into enemies on this side right here. And this is exactly where McFarlane's strengths really play into it very well as far as their development of accessories, because this thing is very, very robust, feels very solid, very firm, really well done as far as the quality for the sculpting. And then when it comes to architectural little details incorporated on the surface of the gun itself, you have some really nice little inclusions as far as the little runes sculpted into the side of the gears right here. Of course, the different levels of the detail that are lifted practically from the render of the gun in game, as well as like nice little conveyor belts and gears shifting, especially when you take a look inside of the gun itself, where you can kind of make out a little bit of the gears that crush those bones into little pieces to then send out flying. You'll notice that just a little bit right there at the hole. And you do have these pieces that are molded out of a rubberized plastic to prevent any major breakage, but at the same time, they still feel pretty firm in hand. And to me, my favorite little detail of this whole thing, apart from the little skulls fitted into these nice little hydraulics here on the side, is the main skull here covered in a nice airbrushed bloody paint decal, which is done really nice. It feels legitimately lifelike. And to me, my favorite thing that goes above and beyond that would have to be the inclusion of extra skulls sculpted into the under cartridge, if you will. Not necessarily the handle, because the handle is technically here towards the back, but this nice little reservoir that fits added ammo, if you will, where he refills the ammo for the gun in and of itself. You have more skulls sculpted in there, and you could argue that maybe they could have gone for a different method of just sculpting this as all one piece, but they managed to detail and paint it in a nice, thorough way that makes it seem like there's separated skulls that simply just fit into the inside part of this whole cage right here. And you can even kind of make out a little bit of, I don't want to say translucency, but you can kind of make out like the pieces are separated to where they might have made the skulls and then simply just enclosed the molding of the gun around them. So therefore, it kind of gives it this nice little premium detail that feels like there's legitimate skulls being loaded up to be going out flying and deliver carnage from the Doomslayer himself. And there's no denying the sheer amount of badassery that it's able to add to the figure when you have Doomslayer actually holding the pulverizer in hand, brandishing the shield on the other, and he legitimately looks badass. But unfortunately, that was still not able to take away another nitpick that I had, even from when this guy was first revealed, is that I still think that at least one other gun could have been included. Just one. If not for the extra pair of hands, then one other gun. Because for those of us who have played the game to completion, you'll know that there's a couple of other guns, some of which are a little bit on the spoilery side, but there's literally like one or two that I can think of right now. In fact, I'll say one that's not necessarily too spoilery because you've seen it in plenty of reviews, but there's a specific weapon called the chain shot. And even though I personally didn't like playing with it in game, it's not one of my preferred weapons, but it definitely has a very aesthetical detail about it that would have made for a cool accessory in figure form, with the little ball being loosened from the chain, very similar to the flare going on over here. And I feel like that would have added some level of value to the overall package, because once you're able to look past the weaponry, you're effectively kind of done covering everything that's in the box, save for, of course, the traditional inclusions like the base and the trading card. And with the Elite Edition, you also get this bonus card that is branded the Elite Edition Points Reward System. And as you can note right there, you'll see that this card is redeemable for 50 points. Something that you won't know until you cut it out of the box, because it comes with this side facing forward. And naturally, the whole reason for this is because the Elite Edition is going to be holding kind of like their own reward system for the Elite series. Except it's kind of not, which is unfortunate, because I was thinking that maybe they were going to have like a separated reward system with their own rewards to be able to redeem for the points that you are able to build up inside of that system. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because when you go to the site that's listed on the card and sign in or create your account, obviously it's inciting for both, but in my case, I simply just signed into my existing account. The points that I've already been garnering by simply just buying things off the store or redeeming the codes that come included in some of my shipments are also still there, being able to be utilized for the Elite points or the Elite Edition system. So I don't necessarily need the specific points that come with this card, which get revealed to be 50 points when you flip it on the outside. So that surprise factor is kind of stripped away here, because when you flip it around, you're either going to be holding a 50-point card or a 300-point card. And on the one hand, I was thinking, well, okay, 50 points towards their Elite Edition rewards. What do they look like? Yeah, right now, they're not that great. I would say that probably the biggest one I have my eyes set on would maybe be Weapons Pack 3. But apart from that, you only got a couple of little pins that you can read, the McFarlane Toys logo pins, or some prototypes that don't necessarily look all that appealing. Apart from that, I would argue that you probably have a much wider breadth of choice in the basic reward system as opposed to the Elite Edition one. And that's not necessarily the best first impression to have. So right now, your only real incentive to look out for the Elite Edition cards that come included in these entries for the Elite Edition series would be if you flip the card and you're brandishing either a red or gold card that, say, you either got a prototype, an unpainted prototype that you could redeem specifically for, or an autographed prototype that's going to be autographed by either Todd or somebody on the team. Who knows? I don't necessarily know exactly who is going to be the one in charge of that autograph, but so far that's the only real difference between the Elite system and the standard reward system. As far as I can tell, I simply am going to take these 50 points and just add them to my account, so that later on, when the Batman Returns wave drops, when the Pattinson Batmobile or any subsequent DC Multiverse releases come down the pipeline later in the year, that's effectively where it's going to go down towards. Because right now, I don't necessarily see a great motivator to really indoctrinate myself within the Elite Edition, aside from the possibility that maybe they'll incorporate some better rewards, because right now, they aren't necessarily it. So I can maybe make a guess as to what it is that you're thinking right now. That's it? For $60? Maybe 50 if you get lucky enough to find them at Walmart? And I don't necessarily blame you for that befuddlement, because, like I mentioned, an extra pair of hands, one more weapon out of the arsenal that we know for a fact Doomslayer is boasting in the Dark Ages, yeah, that probably would have benefited the overall value acquisition that you get right out of the box, and to make a much more fonder impression, because at the end of the day, that whole little rant that I just went on for the Elite Edition program, it is nonetheless a reward system that's supposed to be supplemental. It's not necessarily why you buy this figure. It's really about what you get as far as the core figure in terms of detail, paint application, and articulation. 2 out of 3 is not necessarily bad, and that's why I want to reaffirm that the actual build quality, the solid weight and feel to the figure does in fact feel very premium, and that's ultimately what they set out to do with this price point and with this series. The Elite Edition series is for the actual quality of the build and the paint applications and the sculpture to feel elite. But it does feel like along the way they sacrificed a few other aspects that does kind of make these figures feel elite while not necessarily be price elite. Because I can think of a assortment of DC Multiverse figures that were released back in 2021, 2022 that legitimately feel like Elite Edition figures that were going for a whopping $20, $22.99, $23.99 maybe, $25 if they were like a Build-A-Figure, or even one of the inaugural collector's editions that were first released back in late 2022, 23, etc. Those, I feel, were kind of matching what we got going on right here, but at least they made the impression, they kind of conveyed the emotion of getting an Elite figure without necessarily having to create a label for it. And here, if you are gonna go as far as to create a legitimate trademark of the title Elite Edition and subsequently pricing it at a higher caliber to maybe kind of build this fan base that is much more dedicated than your average Walmart goer or Target goer, then you need to be able to meet those expectations. And I feel like here, most of those expectations are riding on the shoulders of Doom Guy himself, that are completely covered in this faux fur cape that, trust me, is awesome. It definitely feels great in hand, and that goes the same for some of those paint applications and the chainmail and all that stuff. But that stuff is able to definitely work for me. It's not necessarily going to work for everybody else. And it's with the heavy lifting that the Doomslayer himself is doing that this first Elite Edition entry is able to go on by with a very, very solid and firm 7 out of 10. Through and through, I kept thinking about it and thinking to myself, I think he lands at a 7. For a little while I was thinking 8, but then I have to consistently think of that price point. What exactly makes me happy for the 60 bucks? And I feel like here I kept going back to one more weapon, one extra pair of hands. That is it. One or the other. It doesn't necessarily have to be both. But at this point, it still comes just that short that I feel like a 7 is pretty fair here. I have to go with IGN's stereotypical rating. And where I'm sitting from, I would argue that the Elite Edition could still be, right now, I'm still not shaken away from the impression that the Elite Edition and maybe, huge emphasis on the word maybe, the Mortal Kombat series could carry McFarlane Toys without the DC license should they relinquish that in 2026. But if they strategize it correctly, because there's still room for them to kind of fall on either side, either on the side of success or on the side of failure. And right now, the Elite Edition, I'm a little scared that maybe they're announcing a little bit too much without focusing on an entry and one foot in front of the other. But because at this point, I think we're down to like the 5th Elite Edition already revealed, with 3 of them being made out of Fallout. So on that note, with a good amount of those reveals already underway for the remainder of the year, maybe even into the first couple of months of 2026, and even a couple of those entries already being found in stores such as Doomslayer here or Lilith, what would you guys want to see in the Elite Edition? Of course, you do have some DC entries that could be considered. We already technically have one coming down the pipeline, one that I would argue did become a little controversial, that kind of sort of feeds into some of the remarks I had on Doomslayer during this review. But at the same time, I'm right up there with an awful lot of other people that would love to see an absolute Batman fully take advantage of the Elite Edition branding, or maybe an Arkham series reissue 2.0 of sorts for either Arkham Asylum Batman, Arkham City Batman, or even Arkham Knight Batman, but he comes with like a shit ton of accessories. But at the same time, if we are to take the DC license out of the equation, considering its finite sort of longevity and just consider other properties, what's something that's kind of a wild card, sort of out of nowhere, and you would love to see be made into an Elite Edition McFarlane Toys figure set at $60 or $50 if it's at Walmart? And let me know what your guys' entries and considerations are down in the comment section. While you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.